Good morning, everyone. My name is Valentina Izmirlieva, and I'm the director of the Harriman Institute and one of the co-organizers of this event. It is a very special time for us to be here, finally crowning a very long process of preparations, more than 5 years, I think. And we're extremely grateful to our hosts, the Pera Museum and Columbia Global Center Turkey, for making it possible. So allow me to first give the floor to Mr. Birol, who is our gracious host today, the director of Pera Museum.
Thank you. Our valued, precious guests, good morning to all. On behalf of the Sunay'ın Nankıraç Foundation and our teams as Pera Museum and Istanbul Research Institute, I welcome and greet all of you with respect. We have a history of 5 years from the Iraida Bari exhibition project to the present day. In 2019, we chose a new path with a different approach. We focused on a comprehensive archive exhibition. Then the COVID-19 global pandemic intervened. In this process, in this period, the idea of Istanbul's Russian Moment exhibition project emerged. However, we wanted to take the first step with a qualified and comprehensive symposium, and we have come to these days. Of course, we continue to work on an exhibition project that we can carry out at the earliest convenience. After all, we are here together today despite the pandemic and wars. Now let's focus on our symposium and enjoy the Armistice Istanbul, the rediscovered Byzantine heritage, the artists in transcultural dialogue, the Iraida Bari archives, and the Pera memory walk. If I may, I would like to express our sincere gratitude, thanks to our valued partners, Columbia University, Columbia Global Centers Istanbul, Harriman Institute, Carnegie Company, our convener, dear Valentina Izmirlieva, our participants, Holger Klein, Vladimir Alexandrov, Sergei Ivanov, Nadezhda Podzemskaya, Edward Kasinec, Ayşegül Güler, Yekaterina Aygün, Cengiz Kahraman, and to our dedicated Istanbul Research Institute team and Pera Museum team, and to dear Carly for coordinating the program, and my dear friend Ipek Taha, the director of Columbia Global Centers Istanbul, and her valuable team. I wish a fruitful symposium for all of us. Welcome again. And I would like to kindly invite dear Ipek to the podium, please.
Thank you, Özalp, for that. And thank you for all the times you have supported Columbia University and Columbia Global Centers Istanbul. We would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you in this symposium, as well as longtime colleagues, esteemed Columbia professors Holger Klein and Valentina Izmirlieva. They have both supported and guided the work of the Istanbul Center in numerous ways. Wars, revolutions, migrations, They break us, they break our families, our livelihood and traditions, but the consequences also can unite us, unite our humanity, and build bridges between cultures. You may hear Russian or Ukrainian in the streets of Istanbul today due to the devastating war occurring as we speak. You might also hear Arabic much more often than perhaps a decade ago. We struggle with difficult human and survival stories a century after the Bolshevik Revolution that brought the Russian emigres to Istanbul. I'm joined today by my colleagues Merve Ispahani, academic coordinator and Columbia PhD in Ottoman history, Can Kantarcı, editor, writer, translator, and the communications manager, and Ata Türkoğlu, our program officer. We're thrilled to have supported the symposium today and look forward to the ideas and dialogues that will arise from it. Welcome once again. Thank you.
Good, it's a pleasure to be here, as it usually is, to be in Istanbul and in the second home in Istanbul at the Pera Museum and the Columbia Global Centers. I would like to welcome all of you to the symposium as the first chair of the first session. And I would like to ask our speakers of the first session to perhaps come up and take their seats at the podium. It's been a long time in the coming. We already heard this. We planned a project that was an archival project in 2018, I believe it was. In 2019, we had conversations here. In 2020, the world changed with a pandemic. We had to pivot, and we pivoted twice. We pivoted from an archival exhibition to ideas about an exhibition on a larger scale, about a moment of refugees and a centennial of the arrival of refugees from the Russian Empire in Istanbul that changed the culture of the city in ways that was unpredictable and had lots of fruits that we are still reaping today. When refugees arrive, the moment of crisis is first overwhelming, but in the long term, in the longue durée, those immigrant groups or those refugees who come through and then settle elsewhere bring with them traditions that they carry in their hearts and in their limited luggage. But what they contribute to the communities that encounter them in these cities on the way, or the cities that might become a temporary home, has borne fruit over centuries and perhaps millennia in the literature, in the arts, and in the culture of a people and of their neighbors. So what we are exploring today is a moment in the history of this city, Istanbul, that is shaped by the people who arrived over centuries, and in particular a century ago. So without further ado, I will join my colleagues, and we will start with the hard work of this symposium, of bringing the fruits of our collective labor together to explore a moment that still needs research, that is still being explored. And we hope that we will make a contribution with our efforts today to look at that moment and perhaps give us something to work with for our current moment, which is a moment of crisis that we cannot quite fathom yet. The pandemic is one crisis that was followed by a second one that has an impact on our project. And we will have to see how it plays out. But I think we will all make an effort to understand the past and shape the future with the cultural efforts that human beings put into their environments and their communities. So thank you very much, and I will speak from the other microphone. So it is a great pleasure for me to open this first session on the encounter in context Istanbul under the Armistice. And our first speaker is Valentina Izmirlieva, the organizer and mastermind behind this entire project. And for all of you who do not know Professor Izmirlieva, she's a professor of Russian and Balkan cultures at Columbia University and director of the Harriman Institute. Most of her research examines cross-religious exchange in multinational empires. And her current book project focuses on Christian-Muslim cultural exchange in the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century. She founded and leads the Black Sea Networks, a global initiative to investigate the Black Sea as a hub of cultural, political, and historical interest. The long-term project of Russian Istanbul, including the conference and the projected exhibition that Özalp Birol talked about here at the Pera Museum, is part of that initiative. And I should say that as a colleague, it has been wonderful to work with Valentina, not only on this project, but also on other projects that brought us to Istanbul before, last time in 2019, and that brought us together as colleagues in the context of Columbia University. Valentina, the podium is yours, and we are looking forward to your intervention.
Thank you, Holger, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here. The title of my brief presentation today is The Four Paradoxes of Istanbul's Beyaz Ruslar Moment, 1919-1923. As you all know, that following the defeat of the White Army in Crimea in November 1920, between 40 and 200,000 former subjects of the Russian Tsar, depending on who's counting when, found refuge on the Bosphorus. A human flood that swelled the population of the Ottoman capital by as high as 20% at its peak and caused a then unprecedented refugee crisis. As a result, for several years, Istanbul, and especially its European part of Beyoğlu, became almost Russian, teeming with crowds of refugees from the Ottomans' rival empire of the north. I have called this transformative time Istanbul's Beyaz Ruslar moment, using the traditional Turkish label for the newcomers. With this shorthand, I aim to identify a cluster of events that foreground, on the one hand, the significance of Istanbul for the history of Russian global dispersion after the revolution, and second, the role of the refugees from the disintegrated Russian Empire in the transformation of the city itself. Despite its significance, this moment has been surprisingly understudied in the history of Russian immigration and has only recently begun to attract the serious scholarly attention it deserves. My own work and the work of this team, this symposium itself, are part of a larger scholarly effort to put this moment on the map, and not merely for Russian and Turkish studies, but also for the history of forced migration globally. In my brief presentation today, I will attempt to sum up the significance of this moment together with its historical peculiarities in the form of four paradoxes. Paradox 1. The Russians had dreamt of conquering Constantinople for centuries. When they finally arrived, however, they came not as victors, but as refugees. In that sense, the moment was drenched in political irony. It's no secret that Constantinople has always loomed large in the Russian political imagination, and in many ways still does. Russians call it Tsargrad, the city of the Tsar, and ever since it fell under Muslim rule in 1543, they have dreamt of placing a Russian cross on Hagia Sophia. In 1915, the Russian government secretly signed an agreement with the Allied forces that allowed Russia to take control over the city in case of Germany's defeat during the Great War. But the Russian Empire's fate, of course, was sealed otherwise, and the opportunity was lost in the bloodbath of the revolution. That's when the remains of the Russian army finally made it to the city of the Tsar. In 1920, they arrived in defeat, not victory. We drank the bitter cup of national humiliation to the dregs, wrote in 1923 Vladimir Davets and Nikolai Lvov in their memoir, The Russian Army Abroad. We understood what it means to become stateless people and unwelcome guests. Or, as the young Turk Muftizadeh Ziyabey quipped in his memoir, speaking of the Turks a year earlier, the dream of Peter the Great of making a Russian city of Constantinople has partially come true, but it has turned into a nightmare. With a further twist of history, the city that met the refugees was not the city of their imperial dreams either, but a defeated and divided metropolis under the Allied occupation. Partitioned among the French, British, and Italian armies, and soon to be relegated as Istanbul to the periphery of the emerging Turkish Republic, Constantinople was in many ways a stranger to itself, and no one was really at home there, not even the Turks. As a result, the Ottomans and the Russians met in the city of their imperial ambitions not as rivals, measuring their relative political might as they had done in many wars before that, but as political losers, made equals in their shared ruin, as have-beens who had found themselves on the proverbial wrong side of history. These new circumstances fostered unexpected solidarity among yesterday's enemies. To quote the ideologue of the White Movement, Vasily Shulgin, when masses of Russians, hungry and homeless, descended upon Constantinople, the Turks greeted them not with the natural hatred such invasions inspire, but with the compassionate sigh, "Хорошо, Rus, хорошо," or "the Russians are all right." In turn, the guests responded to their hosts with a lasting sense of gratitude, expressed most poignantly perhaps in the 1923 almanac Farewell, на прощание, also known simply as Спасибо, thank you. Paradox number 2. The second paradox has to do with the impossible name of this moment, which further reflects its historical complexities. The Turkish hosts called the refugees Beyaz Ruslar, white Russians, homogenizing them both ethnically and politically, and so do historians still, in search of a convenient label. And yet, the refugees were neither only Russian nor only white, which is to say aligned with the political ideal of restoring the Russian monarchy. They were Russian only in the general sense of arriving from the collapsed Russian Empire, but by ethnicity and culture, they were enormously diverse, as befits the subjects of an enormous empire. As the Turkish historian Penar Yure recently noted, many of them were not even Russian speakers, and yet they were regarded, as he says, as Russian by their host society because of their country of origin. Many of the protagonists of this moment had hyphenated identities and versions of their names in multiple languages, which reflects the cosmopolitanism of Russian imperial life. Let's take, for example, the Belarusian poet Vladimir Dukelsky, better known in the West as the jazz composer Vernon Duke, whose grandmother was reportedly a direct descendant from the kings of Georgia. He wrote and published his first jazz compositions in Istanbul during his year-long stay. Or take the mystic Armenian of Greek descent, Georgi Gurdjieff, or Yorgos Georgiadis, who transferred from Tbilisi to Istanbul, his Institute for Harmonious Development of Man, and staged there a ballet of rhythmic dances based on the practices of the Ottoman whirling dervishes. Or take the Ukrainian avant-garde painter Alexei Hryshenko, known in Russian as Alexei Grishenko, who influenced with his unusual style budding Turkish modernists like Ibrahim Jala and Namık Ismail, and created a series of fantastic watercolors of Istanbul that later stunned Paris and launched his career there. Or take Valentina Taskina, Baroness Klatfort-Jugensburg, who was born in Grozny in Chechnya to a family of mixed Polish, Tatar, and Ukrainian origins, married a German aristocrat, and arrived in Istanbul as a young widow. She stayed there to the end of her life, becoming the first pianist of the Turkish radio. And the list goes on. The Greek singer of romances, Yuri Morfisi, owner of one of the most fashionable nightclubs in Pera called Strelna. The lesbian Lydia Krasa Arzumanova, later known under her Muslim name as Leyla Arzuman, who remained in Turkey until her death in 1988 and played an important role in the birth of Turkish ballet as both a pedagogue and a choreographer. The virtuoso Romani violin player, master of the Russian gypsy romances, from Bessarabia, Jean Gulesco, who won the audiences of Beyoğlu after having been the favorite musician of the last Russian Tsar. The Georgian writer and visual artist Ilyas Danievich Ilyas, born in Tbilisi to a Polish father, who spent 2 years in Istanbul before writing in Paris the arguably best literary work about the Beyaz Ruslar moment, his novel Philanthropy. The Georgian princes Koki Dadiani and Niko Nadharadze, scions of the princely houses of Semergrelo and Imereti, who opened a wine cellar on a Pera side street and introduced Istanbul to some of the best Georgian wine and food ever served there. Foma Gartman, the Jewish Ukrainian composer, well known in the West as Thomas de Hartmann, who conducted a series of world-class concerts at Pera Palais. The German Nikolai Kluge, who had served as a full-time painter in the Russian Archaeological Society in Constantinople before the war, who became a Turkish citizen and a member of the American Byzantine Institute in 1930, and was then personally responsible for uncovering the frescoes of Hagia Sophia. And of course, the list cannot go without a mention of the Black Russian, Frederick Thomas from Mississippi, who, after having conquered Moscow with his music, reigned in Istanbul for several years as the Sultan of Jazz. Politically, the refugees were equally diverse, hardly driven by the same monarchic ideal as the name suggests. They ran, in fact, the entire political gamut from white to red, with all the shades of pink in between. Along with officers of the White Army like General Wrangel himself and ideologues of the white idea like the already mentioned Shulgin, along with sworn monarchists and very conservative clerics and monastics, the refugees included also many liberals, like, for example, the Nabokovs, who passed through the city for one day, and even more apolitical people who were simply swept by the flood of history for personal reasons, by private circumstances or sheer accident. And occasionally, in this flotsam and jetsam of the Civil War, there were some real red spies hiding in the crowds, like, for example, the terrorist Elena Ferrari, a pseudonym of Holger Izvina, who, under the cover of an Italian poet, organized the spectacular assassination attempt at Wrangel on October 15, 1921, when she blew up his private yacht Lukul in the Bosphorus. So, when we use the shortcut and call this refugee group simply Russians, we have to be very careful whose agendas we are actually serving and how much of the richness, complexity, and cultural content of this moment we cover over by such a label. Paradox 3. While the refugees had not come to Istanbul to stay, and many thought of their time in the city as empty, it proved deeply transformative for them and for the city that hosted them. The White Army and the civilians who had come to Istanbul with it in 1920 saw their Black Sea exodus as a temporary evacuation and expected to return to Russia as soon as the political tide turned. When it became clear that Russia was no more, they turned their eyes westward. By the end of 1923, most of the refugees had left Turkey, and the moment was officially over. In other words, the encounter between the city and the refugees was a very brief episode, a moment indeed, that was never meant to last. For the refugees, however, this Istanbul moment was not so much a segment of time locked between 1919 and 1923. In a much more important sense, it was a mode of being, a state of suspended existence, both between two seas, between states, between lives, segments, and meanwhile, a pure interval, if you will, the interval experience. It granted them not only a necessary distance from the trauma of the revolution and the Civil War, but also a reorientation, a new perspective that allowed them to reorient and redefine themselves so that they could move forward. It was in Istanbul that for the first time the former subjects of an empire had to accept their stateless existence and collectively reinvent themselves not only as citizens of the world, but as Russians without Russia, in a world where their country did not exist anymore. Such radical dissolution of previously solid identities unlocked, together with grief and despair, an enormous charge for creative experimentation, which forever changed both them and their hosts. And while the refugees tried to make do with whatever they had at their disposal to survive, they transformed not only themselves, but also left indelible traces on the city that hosted them. After this moment, Istanbul was never the same. The refugees introduced new artistic forms, from classical ballet to jazz, and revived already burgeoning ones such as classical music and visual arts, especially realist genres such as landscapes and portraiture. In their strive to survive, thousands of artists among the refugees engaged across the city in nonverbal performing arts that easily evaded the language barrier. Improvisation became the art of survival for them, the template for a creative subversion of trauma and loss, and for cultural dialogue across difference. The most visible results of their improvisational tactics, however, were left on Turkish everyday life. The Russian visitors transformed the urban texture and habits of the Ottoman capital, especially in the sphere of leisure. They introduced new eating establishments in Beyoğlu with such innovations as female waitresses and dancing floors that encouraged gender commingling. The Russians also imported from Crimea their beach culture, creating modern, non-segregated beaches along the Bosphorus and the Princess Islands, and teaching Istanbulites how to enjoy sunbathing and swimming in the sea. And I have to mention here the wonderful exhibition that Pera had several years ago on that subject. Street culture was also modernized, especially in terms of fashion, that quintessential female sphere of modernity. The refugees introduced the short hairdos, the dropped waistlines, and the raised hemlines of the Jazz Age, together with European-style shoes and Russian furs, and new refugee-run shops and seamstress ateliers sprouted across the city. And here we come to paradox 4. Counterintuitively, perhaps, it was women, not men, who were the main agents of cultural change, and thus the real protagonists of the Beyaz Ruslar moment. There are good reasons for that. The male effort of the Civil War had failed, And in the new brutal reality of exile, men had the double disadvantage of being emasculated by their political and military defeat and by having lost all the sources on which their gender power was based back in Russia. Not so with the women. Apart from their evidently greater adaptability, the women among the refugees had the added advantage of providing the Ottoman society with living, breathing, and visually accessible models of European-style modernity. Ottoman society in the Roaring Twenties was on the brink of its modernization. Borrowed Western ideals of modern femininity dominated the city's imaginary, but they could do little in the way of providing practical models for transforming the outmoded Ottoman gender dynamic. Unlike the Levantines, who had hitherto pushed for the modernization of Istanbul, the Russian female refugees were no surrogates of Western modernity. They were what Americans would call the real thing. Among them were not only members of the upper crust of Russian society, whose culture and education rivaled any of Europe's best, but also a large share of Russia's creative elite. Many of them spoke several languages, had refined social manners, chic Parisian clothes even when in tatters. So they easily emerged as icons of modern female sophistication and elegance despite their sorry circumstances. The women from the Russian Empire, elegant, cultured, physically distinct in both appearance and attire from Ottoman women, and I'm talking here about ideals, not about individuals, became the ultimate cathartic object in the city, the object of both male sexual and female mimetic desire. Significantly, many of these women who flooded the city were both trained and talented in a variety of arts, from classical ballet and modern dance to jazz, folk, and popular music, and their desperation urged them to put these skills to work in the numerous establishments for entertainment that emerged in the city, putting their female body, refugee body, both revealed and repackaged, on the stage as an effective tool in their struggle for survival. Classical ballet, which the Russians are credited with introducing to Turkey, is perhaps the best example to illustrate this larger trend. By revealing the female shoulders, arms, and legs while repackaging the body in a fantasy of silk, tarlatan, and tulle, ballet performances produced a tantalizing yet culturally sophisticated and therefore acceptable image of sublime female beauty. And Turks, Levantines, and Westerners in the city alike unanimously expressed their appreciation with a collective хорошо, which quickly became a loanword in Turkish as an appellative for all Russian women, and then in a telling synecdoche for all Beyaz Ruslar, proving discursively that the women functioned indeed as the public face of the Russian refugees. If in the end the Russians did momentarily conquer Istanbul, as they had dreamt for centuries, it was only with a female touch. Let me, in conclusion, consider briefly the question, so what? That killer of all academic enthusiasm. Why talk about this moment at all 100 years later? Is there anything for us there which is worth our while? After all, historiographers have long neglected this moment, dismissing it as brief and by presumption perhaps unproductive and unconsequential. Does this brief moment really matter? I firmly believe it does, especially for us now, and will suggest to you a couple of reasons why. This moment matters because it challenges our modern perception of crisis as a breakdown and externalizes its potential to become a breakthrough. The Greek word krisis is actually not a sentence but a trial, a test of our inner fortitude, an opportunity to embrace rather than an opportunity for us to embrace rather than a punishment for us to fear. The Beyaz Ruslar moment is exactly a crisis in that sense. It matters also because it reveals improvisation as the highest art form of survival. The art of survival is in a perpetual improvisation, my friend and the political scientist Ivan Kristev once wrote. He could have written it for the Beyaz Ruslar moment, when improvisation itself became the art of survival for the refugees. That moment, therefore, not only encourages us to embrace a crisis as a breakthrough, but also points to the way how. Furthermore, that moment matters because it showcases women as effective cultural agents in a situation of crisis. Our societies, no matter how non-traditional they flatter themselves to be, still turn to men to solve the problem of a crisis. By highlighting the female capacity for adaptability and creative subversion of diminished circumstances, the Beyaz Ruslar moment suggests that women might be better equipped to lead the way in crisis. Finally, by revealing the positive role of the refugees for the modernization of Istanbul, this moment reminds us something that we all should know but often forget. That when we extend a hand of welcome, even to our deadliest enemies, in a moment of crisis, as the Ottomans did to the Russian refugees 100 years ago, even as they themselves struggled with their own disasters of the moment, such a gesture of generosity is always also a gift to ourselves, though the rewards we receive may not be easy to foresee within the moment itself. Thank you.
Valentina, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think we'll move right through the panel, and perhaps if there is a moment for questions at the end, we will address those indeed before the coffee break. We'll move on to our second speaker this morning, Vladimir Alexandrov of Yale University. And for those of you who are not familiar with Vladimir Alexandrov's work, you will find out more about it through his presentation, but Professor Alexandrov is Professor Emeritus of Russian Literature at Yale University, has taught at Princeton and Harvard as well, and a graduate seminar on Russian emigre culture between the wars at Yale led to his discovery of Frederick Bruce Thomas, the son of former slaves in Mississippi, who became a multimillionaire impresario in Tsarist Moscow and the Sultan of Jazz in Istanbul. The discovery later resulted in the biography The Black Russian, which is currently under option for a TV series. And anybody who has read this book or listened to it, I think it also exists as an audio book version, will see the appeal of this figure for a TV series. So if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend doing so. And what we will hear is a teaser from Professor Alexandrov in his talk, Frederick Bruce Thomas and Being Black in Constantinople.
Thank you, Holger. I couldn't have said that better myself. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this symposium. In contrast to Valentina's masterful overview of this complex event referred to as the Russian moment, I'm going to zero in, as Holger indicated, on one very interesting individual. Why focus on him? Well, because he spent a significant part of his life from 1919 to 1928 in Istanbul. His life can be conceived of as a lens that allows us to view some important aspects of the cultural ferment in Istanbul at that time. And finally, he himself was an agent of the kind of change to which Valentina alluded in her overarching remarks. So who he was, Holger already mentioned. The remarkable thing is that he was the son of former slaves born in the deep American South in Mississippi. He grew up on a family farm. Racism was an inherent part of American life after the Civil War. It remains to some extent a part of American life to this day, and it ultimately drove Frederick Thomas from the South to the North of the United States, where racism was less pronounced, and then from there to Europe to escape it altogether. He worked in various European countries with his portable professions of being a waiter and a valet. After trying Western Europe, he went to Russia, where because of his skills, he became a multi-millionaire entrepreneur in the field of popular entertainment. When the revolution came, he had to flee the Bolsheviks, took temporary refuge in Odessa. When the Bolsheviks were on the verge of taking that city for the first time, he escaped to Constantinople and thereby became part of that flood of different kinds of people, all subsumed under the category of Russians, who found refuge in Constantinople. But you can see that he was actually a Black American who was part of this Russian wave, although I might mention that in 1915, he actually received Russian imperial citizenship, a remarkable figure. He made a second fortune in Constantinople as an entrepreneur. I'll say a few things about that in a few minutes. However, after the Republic was proclaimed, he ran into financial difficulties and wound up dying in Istanbul in 1928. He's buried in the Fariköy Catholic Cemetery in Istanbul. So although he was widely known during his life, he was forgotten very quickly after he died, and it was my great good fortune to have come across him and to be able to write his biography, which exists in Turkish as Sia Rus. It's also been translated into Russian as Chorny Ruski, Istoria Одной Судьбы. So that's very briefly his life. I'd like to look at it now more closely in terms of the issue of his blackness or his race, because it defined how he lived in the various cultures and countries through which he passed. It doesn't require repeating that the United States was an institutionally racially marked country during the end of the 19th century. So when Thomas emigrated to Western Europe, one of the most striking things he discovered was that in countries like England, France, and Italy, not so much Germany, but at least in these other countries, there was no discrimination against Black people. There were other kinds of racism. The British were notoriously racist against South Asians. The French had explosions of anti-Semitism, as during the notorious Dreyfus affair. But the only anti-Black racism that existed in Western Europe in the 1890s, for example, was manifested by visiting American tourists who brought their racism with them. And I found fascinating letters written by tourists who had been to Paris or London and who wrote to their hometown newspapers in the United States when they returned, complaining about the fact that they were at, say, a restaurant in Paris and saw a Black man and woman eating together, and nobody seemed to mind, except for the Americans. When Thomas moved to the Russian Empire in 1900, he encountered another kind of colorblind society. As was mentioned, Russia was an ethnically and culturally very diverse entity. There were people in Moscow, where Thomas settled, from all over, from Siberia, Central Asia, of course, Western Russia, the Caucasus, the Black Sea region. As a result, the fact that Thomas was a Black American with African roots, which made him statistically extremely rare. I don't think there were more than maybe a dozen or 24 Black people with some form of African ancestry in Moscow around 1910, a city that had a population exceeding 1 million people at the time. So although he was very rare statistically, he did not stand out, because there were many people from all over whose, using these dated locutions, eyes were not round and whose skin was not white. This is something that allowed Thomas to prosper, in addition, of course, to his intelligence and guile. Of course, I need to mention that the Russians reserved their racist attitudes toward some of their own people, most notably the Jews. Thomas was able to rise to his profession, become the owner of very successful and very popular entertainment venues, something that would stand him in great stead when he made it to Constantinople. I called him the Black Russian because Moscow and Russia was where he was able to develop to his full potential, something that would never have been possible in the United States, might have potentially happened in Europe. When Thomas came to Istanbul in 1919, he entered a matrix of different kinds of cultural contexts that had to do with the issue of race. First is the native Turkish context. As we heard, as we know, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from North Africa, to Europe, to the Near East and into Asia. And it was racially heterogeneous and very tolerant about skin color. So that, for example, my understanding is that an Ottoman Turk would first be interested in encountering a foreigner if that foreigner were Muslim or not. And if the person were Muslim, then the fact that he, as was Thomas's case, a black man, was married to a white woman would not be significant. In the American context, by contrast, marriage between blacks and whites at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was literally illegal in many states. So from this point of view, Thomas found himself in a very congenial cultural context. And of course, we know that black people from Africa rose to very high positions in the Ottoman court, the details of which, of course, you know very well. The Ottoman language, I have been given to understand, did not even contain a term for the word Negro in the American sense, and used Arab or Arab to designate a person of a dark skin color. This was something that survived at least until the 1960s, when the famous Black American writer James Baldwin came to Istanbul and discovered the same thing. So although history had uprooted Thomas very painfully by ejecting him from his adopted country where he had been very successful and landing him in Istanbul, he was very fortunate to have landed precisely in Turkey. The second cultural context that Thomas re-encountered in Istanbul was, of course, the Russian one, because of the large numbers of exiles that we heard about. And they continue to accept him, as they had in Russia proper. Thomas began by running restaurants and entertainment gardens and nightclubs, and almost all of his kitchen and wait staff and many of the performers were Russian refugees. The most famous performers are people like Alexander Vertinsky and Isa Kremer, who went on to have European reputations afterwards. Especially noteworthy, this was mentioned by Valentina, but it's in all of the memoirs of the period of the occupation in Istanbul, were the dames serveuses, as waitresses were called, the French term being the serving ladies. They were typically young Russian women, many of whom were, many others pretended to be nobles. There was no city on the face of the earth in the 1920s that had as many highly ranked Russian noble ladies as Istanbul at the time, whether real or feigned, who became very popular in restaurants because of the way in which they appealed to the male clientele. Even when his staff in his various venues was full, Thomas was remembered by Russian emigres for being very generous toward his fellow former subjects of the Russian Empire, and if he couldn't employ them, he would at least give them a meal, as a result of which they referred to him in some memoirs as the black man with a broad Russian nature, широкой русской душой. But there were other cultural contexts at play, because Istanbul at that time, beginning in 1918, was under Allied occupation, as you know. The British, the French, and the Italians actually administered the city's territories. The Americans were present as well, but they didn't occupy any territory. They simply exerted a military, civilian, and economic pressure on the country. And these four different geopolitical forces at work divided into two different cultural contexts with regard to Thomas's blackness. The French, the Italians, and the British didn't really care that he was black. As a result of which, for example, Thomas received authorization from the British High Commissioner in Pera, because they controlled Beyoğlu in those days, to permission to allow the families of British officers to attend his entertainment establishments. Because these establishments sometimes tended to be risque, this was a sign of high approval. The Americans, however, brought with their diplomatic presence to Istanbul the entrenched racism that characterized the country, especially in the State Department, which administered the foreign representatives abroad. Not all Americans who were in positions of power in Istanbul were racist. One notable exception who deserves to be mentioned is Admiral Mark Bristol, who was the highest military and civilian American representative in the city. The problem then became that Thomas, who had all kinds of problems with papers and his legal standing, turned to the American Consulate General in Istanbul, a very handsome building that survives. It's very close to the Pera Palace, but it's now been converted into a private club, I understand. When he came to the American consular officials for assistance with such things as trying to get a new American passport, they either treated him with condescension or even sabotaged his application for a new passport when he submitted it to them for submission to the State Department in Washington. So Thomas was in this kind of a very mixed area. If he could avoid the Americans in Istanbul, he was okay. And until the Republic was proclaimed in 1923, he did very well. So what did he do in Istanbul that impacted the local culture? When he landed in 1919, there were very few Western-style places of entertainment in Istanbul. In other words, restaurants with music and other kinds of entertainment. It was not in the Ottoman tradition for Turkish men to drink alcohol, of course, or to go to the kinds of Western entertainments that were popular everywhere in Europe. It was, of course, not done for Turkish men to consort with women outside their families. Traditional Turkish women didn't participate in public entertainments at all. But at the same time, with the Allied arrival of thousands of Italian, French, English, and American sailors, soldiers, officers, businessmen, and diplomats, there was a very large population used to Western entertainment and eager to have it. What did they want? They wanted some version of women, wine, and song. I don't mean by this anything like prostitution, although that inevitably entered into the scheme as well. And there was hardly anyone in Istanbul at this time who had had more successful experience establishing places that provided this in a tame form, remember the British approval, than Frederick Thomas. And this fed into a process that was happening in Turkey at the time anyway, which was becoming secularized. Of course, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was a leading exponent of many of these changes. So by doing what he knew how to do best, Thomas inadvertently helped foster the kind of secularization of relations between men and women, entertainment, and so on, that was going on as a conscious project on behalf of the new leadership of the country under Mustafa Kemal. The first establishment that Thomas set up was on the then northern edge of the city in Şişli, at the end of the then existing tram stop. All of this can be traced on Pirvicic's famous insurance maps for Constantinople at that time, for Istanbul at the time, an entertainment garden called the Anglo-American Garden Villa, also known as the Stella Club. It made history on August 31st, 1919, when it hosted the first performance in Istanbul of a new kind of a music, one that would become a key to Frederick's success, namely jazz, which had become popular in other countries and was to become as popular in Istanbul as it did everywhere else. Thomas changed venues repeatedly. The garden in Shishli could operate only during the warm weather. He found a location in the center of the city at what was then called 40 Rue de Brousse. I haven't actually tried to find this on a contemporary map of Istanbul, but it was someplace closer to the center, a place that he called the, excuse me, the Royal Dancing Club, or the Jockey Club. And this points to another activity that he fostered, namely men and women dancing together, something that was not a feature of traditional Ottoman society. He organized lessons so that the Europeanized Turks and the Levantines, who were halfway there anyway in terms of their interests, could learn the new dances that he wanted them to know. He even organized Friday matinee evenings, especially for Turkish ladies. So this again fed into the breakdown of the barriers between men and women that Mustafa Kemal fostered, and there are very famous anecdotes of how Mustafa Kemal would organize a ball, and his officers would stand on one side of the ballroom and the ladies would be on the other side, and he would pretty much order his officers to dance with the ladies by saying that no lady would dare refuse to dance with one of my officers as an attempt to westernize society. The waitresses are important as well from the point of view of interactions between men and women, as was already implied. In traditional Ottoman eating establishments, all of the waitering was done by men. Thomas's most famous establishment, the one that lasted the longest, was Maxim, which he opened on Tuesday, November 22nd, 1921. The location was excellent. It was just off Taksim Square on Sira Selvi Street. The space was actually the basement of the Magic Cinema, one of the largest and most luxurious movie houses in the city, or according to the owners at the time, in the entire Orient. Now, the basement conjures the image of a place that's dark and confined, but because of the severely sloping terrain where this was established, and the remnant, I should add, of the Magic Cinema is still present. It's now that building around which and above which the new Sofitel Hotel has been built. Because of the sloping ground, the basement was actually a high-ceilinged hall and had windows and doors that opened onto a terrace from which there were wonderful views of the Bosphorus and Asia. It was configured as a classic nightclub, a stage, tables, a bar. And for the next 5 years, it became Frederick's most successful venture in Istanbul, so that hardly any memoir of the city at that time fails to mention it. It would also outlive him for another 50 years, because Thomas lost it to creditors for complex reasons in 1927. It was taken over by Turkish entrepreneurs who called it the Yeni Maxim, the new Maxim, at first. Later, it became famous as the Maxim Gazinozu and survived in that way for decades. I managed in 2010, when I was in Istanbul before, to find the last remnants of the Maxim decoration in the space that, when I saw it a dozen years ago, had been transformed into a parking garage. As far as I'm aware, there is no reference to Maxim and Thomas in the Sofitel Hotel, or really anywhere else in Istanbul, such as, for example, the Fadiköy Cemetery where he's buried. Perhaps that's something we can try to change in time to have him commemorated here for his contributions to popular culture in the city. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this rich presentation, which gives a lot of food for thought, what might happen in the future and how this figure can be remembered. And we will get back to this, I think, over the course of our symposium. Let me move on to our third and last speaker in this session, Edward Kasinec, who will present on American elite philanthropy, Anna Mitchell and the Constantinople, Istanbul Russians, 1920 to 29. Edward Kasinec's long career as an archival curator includes service for Harvard University's Ukrainian Research Institute Library, University of California, Berkeley Library, and most notably chief curatorial work for the Slavic and Baltic Division of the New York Public Library. He presently serves as a research associate for the Harriman Institute and Columbia University, and since 2014 as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. Kasinec has more than 200 academic publications and has curated several major exhibitions, including Russia Engages the World at the New York Public Library in 2003-2004. We're looking forward to your presentation, Edward.
Could you show me how to move on? So here, this one. No. I'm extremely privileged to be here this morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. Over the last several years, I've become concerned with a number of themes, most especially with the visual collections, the visual and photographic collections at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and also with the societal interconnections of the American elite philanthropists, and the philanthropy which they directed towards Russia and towards the Russian peoples at the beginning of the 20th century. Very happily, these themes come together in my remarks this morning. They come together in the person of Anna von Schaich Mitchell. Mitchell was born in 1878. And I will also deal in part with her life partner, Alma Ruggles. The 8 boxes of Mitchell's correspondence, pictures, decorations, presentation albums housed at the Hoover Institution were gifted to Hoover in 1966 by Olivia Stokes Hatch, her niece. I've also had access to some of Hatch's and Mitchell's papers at Bryn Mawr, and to a rare collection of gramoty, that is to say, presentation charters to Mitchell, which are housed at the Foundation for Russian History at Jordanville, New York, which is one of the extraordinary collections extraordinary collections of the Russian diaspora. Mitchell and Ruggles both came from a life of great privilege. Mitchell was born in Newport, Rhode Island, a bastion of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. One of 4 children of a prominent New York lawyer. Ruggles was the daughter of George Ruggles, Civil War hero and adjutant general of the U.S. Army. Mitchell's siblings, too, prospered. Her elder sister married the very wealthy Episcopalian priest, canon Anson Phelps Stokes. The younger sister, the South African entrepreneur and politician John Moltenot. Her younger brother was a prominent New York area lawyer. Very early in her life, Mitchell engaged with the settlement movement in New York, the movement to lift up the refugee populations of New York, many of whom came from Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire, and then went during World War I to serve as a volunteer in France and in hospitality centers, refugee centers, and even extended her activities to Serbia. In 1921-22, Mitchells and Ruggles were both settled in an apartment the Grand Dame. They were settled in this apartment overlooking the Dolmabahce area of Istanbul. Here you see, of course, the well-known mosque. And were both volunteering as executive assistants to Admiral Mark Bristol, was mentioned earlier by Professor Alexandrov, was High Commissioner in Turkey and overseer of Middle East and Balkan relief. Mitchell's particular charge was humanitarian assistance to the huddled Russian masses in Dolmabahce, Kasim Pasha districts, Lemnos, Gallipoli, Gallipoli, and the Balkans. And here you see from the Hoover archives images, and of course there are many at Hoover, of some of the accommodations in which the Russians were housed at that time. Helen Bristol, wife of the admiral, became Mitchell's close ally in this relief effort. And she wrote continuously, Madam Bristol, for the American press, pointing, particularly the New York Times, particularly pointing to the parlous state of the Russian refugee population in Istanbul at that time. Quite desperate. The plight of the anti-Bolshevik emigrants to Europe and America quickly drew the attention of many international and U.S. relief and humanitarian organizations, among them the League of Nations, the American Red Cross, the YMCA, American Committee for the Relief and Education of Russian Refugee Children, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, which exists to this day, and the Russian Student Fund, with which Thomas Whittemore was closely associated, in addition to all of his other activities. On the eve of Mitchell's departure to America on a fundraising trip, this was in 1929, the remaining relatively few Russians in Istanbul at that time commissioned the artist, and here, this article, 1929 from the Times, giving their imprimatur to Mitchell's activities. So in 1929, Mitchell departs America, and the remaining Russians commissioned the artist A. Gahn, who I learned from one of our good colleagues was a female artist, to execute a remarkable album, one of many, which exists at Hoover large format album of 12 leaves of watercolors and calligraphic texts. The album was presented to Mitchell as a sign of deep gratitude and respect for their decade-long philanthropic activity. And here you see one of the leaves from the album, and they quote from the Gospels of Matvey, one of her, what they viewed as the guiding principle of her life. Do not turn away from the needy and from the indigent and from the poor. This presumably is one of the streets in a district which was occupied by the Russians. And here is yet another apotheosis of Mitchell, this by another artist, Burnatsky, from the Foundation for Russian History at Jordanville, which is also signed Constantinople. This is an earlier set of gramoty, 1922. You see her initials here. This is also very interesting because you see some of the signatories to these gramoty, this happens to be typed in English, showing their hopes and dreams. Here you see, of course, Lady Liberty in the center, hoping that they aspire from Moscow to Constantinople to New York. Others also joined in praising Mitchell's remarkable work, including, of course, Maria Fyodorovna II, the former Empress of Russia, then living in Copenhagen. She, of course, was Princess of Denmark. And here is the cover of the remarkable Mitchell album at Hoover, which is all beaded, beautiful beadwork with the initials of Ruggles and Mitchell on the cover. It's 20 by 16 inches, quite a large piece. And the cover, Tsargrad, covering this decade. What specifically was she doing that evoked this type of gratitude and piety towards her and respect towards her? She worked with sanatoria. She worked with the sick, providing them with medical support, with their contributed to their ability to become working, to work in various fields here in Constantinople. She helped them emigrate to the then kingdoms of Bulgaria, Serbia. She helped them with their schools. She helped artists, singers, musicians, people of culture of all types. She organized concerts, most especially to the Russians, to the Orthodox Russians. She helped with their church, in this case, with the church abroad. And the head of the religious organization, the Orthodox religious organizations in Constantinople at that time, was Afanasy Gribanovsky, who later became Piervo Hierarch of the Synod of Russian bishops outside of Russia, that is to say, the church in emigration. Let me show you some more leaves from this beautifully executed album. We're, of course, just a short distance from this Galata bridge. Very importantly, for reference purposes, the album contains 400 plus signatures of the recipients of Mitchell's philanthropy. And I went through, I tried to transcribe the names of some of these individuals and also checked them against various biographical tools that were at my disposal at Columbia and at New York Public. And I'll just point out a couple of names from this initial list. You see at the top of the third column, Archbishop Afanasy Grebanovsky. You see at the beginning, the Princes Gedroids, very well known Polish-Lithuanian family, aristocratic family of the Russian Empire. And their descendants, of course, are well known in Europe, in Belgium, and France, in England to this day. And the list goes on and on. And this album was clearly treasured by both Mitchells and Ruggles. In the late 50s, they attempted to have all of the names transcribed for themselves, giving it over to this Общество друзей русской культуры. As far as I know, this was never done. So I think my own work will be the first transcription of this. And I should say that thanks to my colleagues at Hoover, this album has been fully digitized along with other albums in the Mitchell collection. Here you see another signatory, Count Paul Ignatieff. I won't dwell on the history of the family. This is a very important family in Ottoman Russian relations and also in diaspora, in emigration. He was head of the American Red Cross, the Russian Red Cross. And here you see the Count, along with his grandson, Michael Ignatieff, a rather well-known political figure, former rector of the Central European University in Budapest. I believe he's now at Harvard. Some American relief organizations were specifically directed their dollars towards Russians in Constantinople and the Middle East, Balkans, of course. And the album, the text of the album, specifically speaks of American social circles, powerful connections, American friends that Mitchell and Ruggles had. And they specifically reference one of the Mitchell relations, Mr. Stokes, Canon Stokes, to whom Mitchell was continuously turning for funding her activities. And here you see, and I just want, this is a pendant to the hand-drawn album. These are photographic albums held at Hoover, also in the Mitchell collection, of some of the recipients of some of her philanthropy in Serbia, in Bulgaria at that time. generals now working in the vineyards of, or on the roads of these countries. Stokes, and here he is in court dress, was extremely wealthy, the scion of a wealthy New England family, longtime secretary of the Yale Corporation, and then later canon, that is to say head, of the National Cathedral Episcopalian in Washington, D.C. Very prestigious post. Now, board members of these refugee committees, and there were several, give a clear indication of Mitchell's powerful connections, social connections, and her donors. The biographies, and this is significant, of these individuals, and I've looked into many, show their long-standing personal and business relationships with pre-revolutionary imperial Russia and its elites. Some of these Americans no doubt harbored the hope that the military officers and aristocrats who were now living in dire poverty, depredation in Tsargorod would spearhead the renovation of Russia. Alas, not to be. The chairwoman of the board of the American Committee for Russian Relief, Princess Julia Cantacuzene, significant, Countess Speransky, was the daughter of President Grant and a fixture on the Washington social scene. She was married to Count Speransky, Prince Speransky. Another donor, Alfred Lee Loomis, preeminent physicist, lawyer, financier, philanthropist, was the son of Julia Stimson Lewis, herself an important social and relief activist in Europe. Another Maecenas, Bunny Edward Rowland Harriman, who was the brother, younger brother, of Averell Harriman, the great donor to Harriman Institute. Others on these committees, Elihu Root, Secretary of War and State, Nobel laureate, headed an important investigative mission to Russia's provisional government in spring of 1917. Mrs. Robert Lansing was wife of the influential Wilson Secretary of State. Samuel McRoberts, financier, was vice president of National City Bank, which was long established in Russia before the revolution. Mrs. Jasper Whiting, Boston Brahmin, philanthropist, whose foundation exists to this day. This gives you only a small taste of the kinds of people that were standing behind Mitchell's remarkable efforts on behalf of the Russian community in Istanbul. I was very much taken by Professor Ivanov's lecture several weeks ago and his digression into popular culture, into a film by James Bond, and I simply could not resist doing this last slide. In 1928, the young Agatha Christie was living in the Pera Palace, just a short distance from where we're meeting. One can only wonder, one can only speculate, whether one of the Russian princesses that are mentioned in the albums of Anna Mitchell at Hoover served as the later literary prototype for her novel, Murder on the Orient Express. And here you see Dame Wendy Hiller as this imperious Princess Natalia Dragomirov, who figures central character in this novel. And this Princess Dragomirov, interestingly enough, had very powerful American friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward, for this insight into the philanthropic networks. I think I will take up your lead in my talk later in the afternoon. This, I think, gives us a lot to work with for the next couple of hours. There will be coffee waiting for us. In fact, we are 15 minutes. Are we 15 minutes late? I think we are 15 minutes late. But nonetheless, perhaps this is an opportunity for one or the other question in the next 5 to 7 minutes before we get our coffee upstairs in the cafe. Are there any questions for our speakers in this morning session? Yes.
Alexandrov, did I get you correctly that your hero was Muslim?
No.
No, he was not.
No.
Did he any religious affiliation?
His parents founded an African Methodist Episcopal church on their farm in Mississippi. But that's the only official connection with any religion that I found. I think he was buried in the Catholic cemetery in Shishli only because when he was mortally ill, an order of French Catholic nuns took him in, and he died in their hospital in Istanbul. And there was a service for him at the Saint-Esprit Cathedral in Istanbul. And that service is recorded in their record books, as is the burial in Fariköy. But I'm not aware of any significant connection that he had, except for formalities like having his children baptized at a Protestant Lutheran church in Moscow.
Other questions? Yes, Merve.
Fascinating papers. While I was listening, I was curious to know that, we have this wave of immigration from Russia, but only a few years before that, after the Balkan Wars of 1912, right, there was an earlier wave of immigration. This time, Muslims from Bulgaria, Georgia. And there was some already know-how in place, how to, lodge these immigrants, and there was a Bureau of Immigration already in place. But the difference, as I see here, white Russians were mostly accommodated in urban places, or, Gallipoli is an exception, where, Muslims from other regions were mainly accommodated in, rural areas. But still, I would be curious to know if there was any sort of interaction between these immigrants taking place in these urban centers. Does it appear at all in these memoirs, biographies, or is it just, two worlds apart? I would be curious to know more about that if you have any information. Thank you.
I think this is a very interesting question, which I'm not sure any one of us have dealt with, but it's certainly worth exploring. As far as I can say from what I know is that there isn't much of an interaction between this wave of refugees from the Russian Empire with previous non-Muslim refugees after the Balkan Wars. Not even in Orthodox settings. As far as communication between Muslim refugees from the Ottoman Empire, because there was a chunk of those who were not referred to, by the way, as Beyaz Ruslar, and Muslim refugees from the Balkans to Istanbul, I don't know, is the honest answer, but it is certainly very important to explore in the context of our larger project. So I thank you for asking this question. And if my esteemed colleagues have something to add.
Oh, no, I don't.
From my side only that I will talk a little bit about this, but for example, the Imperial Russian Institute of Archaeology that was here, that was of course dissolved long before the 1919 wave of Russian refugees. Some of those Russians stayed on, and that fed later into the recruitment campaign of Thomas Whittemore for his restoration project. Nikolai Kluge was one of those. So I would suspect that people who stayed had networks that others tapped into. Whether there are memoirs or evidence for specific interactions of groups, I couldn't tell, but I would suspect that because of the way that even Whittemore in the 1920s and early 1930s was able to tap into those networks, that they existed, and there must be evidence for these more long-term relationships between people of earlier immigration waves.
There were certainly Russians who were here before on diplomatic or other military service and just as private citizens. But how much integrated they were with other ethnic communities here is something that still needs to be addressed.
Yes, I have a question to Edward. I'm a trustee of Robert College of Istanbul, and this institution we're in also has done an exhibit and a book on the anatomy of a tradition about Robert College. Columbia houses some of our documents and archives, and we have a Mitchell Hall at Robert College. And I was wondering, because the times match, I was wondering if there would have been, I'm going to ask also at the school now, if there would have been any reference to correlation between Robert College of Istanbul and Anna Mitchell. I don't know the answer, but I just wanted to mention this if it's something that you are aware of. And I don't know, Merve has worked, and Holger, you've worked with the Robert College archives, but I was wondering if there would be also, and your institution has worked with the Robert College archives, because sometimes there are stories about the times that are going on that are not necessarily stories about the school, but the larger environment and the dynamic of the city. So I was thinking if it's worth exploring. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Just let me say that among the other collections, that I've been looking at Hoover is the Scipio collection, which also contains a remarkable album of Constantinople, Istanbul, by a professor at Roberts College during this period. And Scipio was deeply involved with the Russian emigre community in Istanbul. So this is something that were there to be an exhibition here at Pera. The Scipio album would also be a remarkable contribution to such an exhibit because it documents his activities at Roberts College during this time.
Yeah. Good. I think we all deserve a coffee break. So we will gather back here at, we are scheduled to get back here in 5 minutes, but I think we will extend the time slightly to, should we say, 12 o'clock? Is that taking too much of a license? I have to ask. It's okay? Fantastic. Good. 12 o'clock. We are meeting here for the second session on the Byzantine legacy rediscovered. Thank you.
I think this is